I think everybody knows Yarrow. Uh, Personally, I've been through, I don't know how many executive secretaries of ProNica I have known. Davida is one, and Yarrow will tell us about others. Davida was one of the most consequential, and Yarrow is the most consequential. I don't want to flatter her too much, but I have been with more than one nonprofit 501c3 that didn't make it. And when it didn't make it, the end was very ugly. Uh, Contracts were breached, leases were breached, people just walked out of the room, office equipment being laid around. I went to Houston once and got $50,000 worth of, yeah, what's the nutcracker costumes. And we never paid them because we just walked out. The chaos that ensues when a 501c3 gets laid down is amazing. Yarrow has, what was the expression that they used? Landed this plane extremely well over a period of years. I don't want to take away, a couple of years ago, my wife was working pretty much full time on shutting down ProNica. But since that time, Yarrow has really made sure everybody was fairly dealt with, and that's about all the flattery I'm going to give you, Yarrow. You're going to have to earn it from here on out.
Okay. Well, Herb, I think I look back and this is about my 7th year. 7 years ago, I was teaching a play group there in the annex, and I had gone out to use the hose and wash something up from their finger painting, and Melissa had the windows open. She was the director then. And she said, "Hey, Yarrow, do you think you could give me a few hours a week? I'm losing my assistant." And I said, yes. And that's how it all started. And within that year, I became the interim director when Melissa had left a little early before our new executive director from Pennsylvania was installed, but then she broke her leg the first week on the job, and that didn't pan out. And we tried to recruit another director, could not do it. And I became stateside director and then eventually executive director. So that was 7 years ago. And actually, the reason I'm here to begin with is because over a century ago, like more than 50 years ago, I began attending St. Pete meeting as a 12-year-old foster child. So I think I'm like the longest living St. Pete meeting attender, but so I will probably die with an honor, and that might be it. I vowed that I would not close ProNica during my directorship, but the universe had something else in mind for me. So like Herb said, we are in the process of laying it down, and our final date will be December the 31st. So I've been asked to give you a little history of ProNica, and I know we're recording this, so if maybe this can help bring clarity to the larger meeting. Okay. I had notes. Let me see. Oh, so everyone associates ProNica with Contra wars. We always think of the Contra wars. We backed the Contras to oppose the Sandinistas. The Contras were the right-wing rebels, and the Sandinistas were the newly elected Marxist, basically, government that I believe was seated in 1969. But the Contra wars continued. The US funded Contras being trained in Argentina, maybe for a larger effort than just Nicaragua. I know El Salvador was part of it. The Bay of Pigs played into it. We had really a geographical relationship because of Bay of Pigs with Nicaragua. That was our interest at the time. Although actually, we started exploiting Central America back in the early 1900s. And if anybody ever heard reference to the Banana Wars, that's really how it began. And that's where that term, that derogatory term, Banana Republic, comes from. So America has been meddling in Central America forever. So approximately 10 years of a civil war in Nicaragua that began when the Sandinistas were seated in 1969, just decimated the country. And we began sanctioning that country, sanctioning Nicaragua, I believe, with Reagan. Reagan withheld relief money based on the belief that the Nicaraguan government would abuse the funds. And we were still very, very nervous when Carter took the presidency because of this constant presence of the threat of the Marxist Sandinista government. And he withheld money as well, but he gave money to the Argentine government to continue training the Contra rebels. And this was because of this Neutrality Act. And the Neutrality Act made it impossible for us to directly be involved in what was referred to as military actions that really we had no U.S. Had a part in. So then, let's see, I believe it was, let me get another set of notes here. Yes, I'm going to start you with the McIntyres. Herb, do you knew the McIntyres personally, didn't you?
I did. People don't let me tell the story, but no.
Okay. Well, in 1985, the McIntyres were living in Nicaragua, and they came to St. Pete meeting to give a talk about what they were experiencing down there. And I believe that was the initial, the beginnings of St. Pete Meetings Association. Thank you. With what would become ProNica. In 1986, a year later, I believe Shauna and her husband, Duran, I can't remember his last name, they helped to purchase the first Land Rover and put it in one of the 40-yard shipping containers that went down. And I think that's when Herb, you got involved with the shipping container process?
I did.
Yes.
People don't like me to talk about it because although it was the birthplace of ProNica, I thought it was the stupidest thing we ever did.
Okay, well, we sent supplies. Like I mentioned, the country was sanctioned and there were no supplies on the shelves. I've read so many books by so many expats who said you could go 6 months without finding a roll of toilet paper. There were no baby diapers. There was no formula, no medicine, no food. So we were putting things, necessities like that in containers. I think that first year you all shipped five packed containers. And we even, did we send a Volkswagen bus down in one? Does that ring a bell?
I remember that. The problem at the time was we had no identity.
Right.
It was just a bunch of people throwing in money. And if somebody stole the containers or something happened to somebody loading the containers, we were in big trouble because we had no identity. Therefore, we had no insurance, we had no protection. We were just a bunch of people. And You can take it from there. The 501c. I only got involved because I didn't want these nice old ladies to get in legal trouble, and they were on their way.
Uh-huh. Well, I think an important part of this talk is probably going to be introducing the relationship of ProNica to meeting. So ProNica started to get kind of formally organized in '89. And at that time, Anna France donated the funds that would build the peace room. And that would,
It's actually called the Anna France Peace Room.
I'm sorry?
It's actually called the Anna France Peace Room, but most people
Yes,
don't know.
that's right. I think it was still on the sign, which I'm not sure is still there, but yes, so that's when ProNica got a home. And I believe that it was a couple of years later when you and Ruth Hyde Payne, who had a relationship with SCYM, gosh, what she was the clerk of trustees for SCYM. And then she became the first director of ProNica, and Herb, you and her in 2002 formally started the charter, the 501c3 that became ProNica.
To clear up the controversy.
Yes,
Shona started it, as you said. And
she
then,
did.
And then it got sort of mystified and smoky because, as I say, there was no identity, and it was going down the drain. And Ruth didn't want it to go down the drain, and that's when she recruited me to do the 501c3. And I never enjoyed a minute of it. It was very tough. It was very tough back then.
Yes. So the early 2000s was when all of the partner organizations became formal. So we had sorted through a lot of different on the ground organizations that we had solidarity with, but we consolidated and we received Casa Cuquera, the Quaker house, that was given to us. El Centro, our office and home for the in-country director. All of those things came together, and we identified Alternatives to Violence project, which was working in the prisons at the time as a formal partner. Etchwall Women's Center, that was the clinic, daycare, and the place where eventually Pam started the hairdressing school. Daycare, that, yeah, pretty much. I'm trying to think what I'm leaving out. Then we had Casa del Nino, which was in Ramon, in San Ramon, which at the time was a cultural arts center, a health center, and I believe they also gave microloans. But they shifted their focus in the last 2 years to dealing with COVID relief, COVID vaccines, and sanitation and things like that. And then they took on the responsibility of caring for the elders of the community to keep them safe and housed during the pandemic, which is still going on to my knowledge. We funded 2 libraries. Of course, Zelinda, our friend who had founded El Quinchos and Los Yohascas, the orphanage that helped to take children who were human trafficked and being exploited on the streets. They were addicted to glue. They were actually nabbed by Zelinda. She'd get them at night and bring them back to what at that time was called the filter house, where they would be detoxed from the drugs and then placed in either the boys or the girls orphanage, if you will, and given medical care, psychological counseling, and education. and then eventually vocation. And to that day, that is one of the most thriving organizations that we are continuing to support. Martin Centennial, which kind of branched off into a women's cooperative and a housing community. So now there's sort of two separate organizations that we are continuing to fund. Let's see. Who did I leave out? Oh, Casa Materna, of course, the women's prenatal care and high-risk pregnancy care, which was closed in 2019 by the government when Ortega started shutting down the NGOs, which precipitated us leaving the country. That's when we pulled out our in-country director, Bambi Griffith, and pretty much shut down in-country support. After that, we became just a direct funder, and we were wiring money into the bank accounts of our existing partners. But then when Trump was in office, he sanctioned and double sanctioned Nicaragua and made it impossible for the banking system to continue to cooperate with international wire transfers from the United States. So for about a year, we pretty much just sat on donations until we figured out a system to get money in country. And I'm winding that up right now. I sent $14,000 to a diocese in Italy that was able to get the money to Zelinda, the director of El Quichos and El Niños, back into Nicaragua to fund the orphanage. We're sending small wires, Western Union wires, to personal agents of our different organizations. We have to send under $700 at a time. And the money we're distributing right now is the money which was the proceeds from the sale of Quaker House. Quaker House was donated to El Porvenir, which is a very large international water and sanitation nonprofit that we chose to partner with and distribute our assets to so that we could apply for closure of the NGO, which is the national organization in Nicaragua. So we did that. And they, even though mid-pandemic, they were able to sell one of the properties, Quaker House was converted into a hostel by a woman who's doing education programs. So it went to a good home, and that's the money I'm distributing now. We have about $5,000 left to distribute from those proceeds. And then ProNica will have divested itself of all of its assets. And we hope to apply to close. That's a criteria for closing the 501c3. We have to close our bank account and zero everything out and have no assets. So it really kind of worked out well that the meeting chose to take the Peace Room and convert it into the library, forcing me to take those files and bring them out and go through them and organize them for the archive, which we're in the process of placing either at the University of Florida or Miami, or possibly the Library of Congress. We don't know. We're working on the finding aid for that, and that should probably be ready to be shopped around in January. And I don't want to go too much longer than this. What did I leave out? Sorry about that. Lot to cover.
No, could you talk a little bit about the archiving that you've been doing, and
Okay,
then
so-
open it to questions?
Okay, so the archive goes back 37 years. I have 37 years of paperwork. I have 2,500 and 60 pounds of paperwork in 39 boxes, archive boxes, that are being stored by a friend in an air-conditioned unit. And he had the unit tinted, and so the tinting killed the silverfish that had gotten into the piece room, which, by the way, I keep forgetting to tell you, make sure they're dead before you put books in there, because I found quite a few of the things. They're paper eaters. So yeah, that archive, we're working with the University of Minnesota. There's an archivist there who is developing a software. He's a software developer specifically for archives, for an online finding aid, which means that everything will be digitized, put into the finding aid, and available to everyone in the entire world who has access to the internet. And they'll be able to see everything that happened from ProNica's point of view and beyond, because I have things from the office in Managua. I have no idea what their source is, but I have newspaper clippings, stories, articles, photographs, things that happened during the Contra Wars that would actually blow your mind. And they need to be preserved. We have over 4,000 images, both print and negative. We have books and publications that were made by Quakers and the larger community that were involved. So we're trying to organize all this, get it ready to be digitized, and then sent to an archive that will put their team of archivists on it and make the thing, finalize it. So basically what we're building is a really elaborate online index. The archivist from University of Minnesota was supposed to be here to begin this process on October 1st. But if you can imagine, a 70-something-year-old archivist from Minnesota didn't want to come to a hot spot like Florida with COVID on October 1st. So he's delayed his trip until January, the first week in January. And he'll be here for 3 weeks, and we will get done what we get done. And after that, it's up to me to place the archive or anybody else who wants to get involved.
I'd just like to say, Yarrow, that I'm just blown away with the history. So many pieces came together, and it's just astounding to me. It's like Margaret Mead says, one step, just one person with a commitment can change the world. And it sounds like you've really changed the world for these folks. Even if you can't be there right now, you've changed their consciousness, and that's very big. Yeah, so I'm going to leave it to everybody else. I'm not going to say anything more. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Yarrow, that was much more difficult for me than I didn't expect it to be difficult, but it was really hard.
That's hard for me. Yeah. It's very sad, but it just happened. It was an organic process. So.
We were at graduation one day. Kids about this big, all dressed up, probably half the annual budget for the family for the year to get their clothes. And they were so adorable, getting their certificates and stuff. And so this guy comes walking over to me. Forgive me. He looks like Noriega. This guy looks like he could take his machete and carve you up for breakfast. He was just the nastiest looking guy, and he's coming right at me. He was in tears. And he thanked me for what we were doing.
Yeah.
It was a moment. It's something I think of every day is in the morning, the trucks would arrive at the dump, and there's no more dump. We should make that clear.
Right.
So everybody would get out and greet the trucks. They didn't like ProNica being there when the trucks arrived because very frequently the truck drivers would exchange recyclables for sex, and they couldn't do that while we were there. And to the point where some of the guards, they knew you were with ProNica, and obviously if you're a white guy with gray hair, you're probably with ProNica, they wouldn't let you in because we were interrupting all their trafficking stuff. But one morning, I'm out there with two boys, and the smoke is really terrible. And they had goggles, but I did not. And what they're doing is as they dump the stuff, they're looking for recyclables, but they're also looking for food. And one of these kids, and they're laughing, having a good time walking around the junk and the smoke and how terrible it is. When one boy reaches down, picks up some food, gives half of it to the dog, and eats the other half himself. They're looking at me. I was falling apart, as I am now. And they're looking at me like, what's wrong with this guy? What? This is just another day for us. And as much as I didn't like working for ProNica was hard all the time on everybody. Most of it was self-destructive hard. But you'd see two kids eating garbage and sharing it with their dogs, and you were trapped.
Yeah. Well, the last time I was in Nicaragua, I was pulled out of a car and I had a homemade flamethrower pointed at me. I mean, it was just the scariest thing. We couldn't get back to where we were staying because of blockades. Oh, and Susan had asked that I mention this. You know, the elections are happening in November, and it was very important for us to try to get the rest of the money down there because, you know, people stop moving around in the month of the elections because they don't want anybody to be able to vote. And a real problem being in country is everyone's wearing a mask. And I mean, a bandana across their face and sometimes their eyes. You can't tell who's who. There's no uniforms. You don't know whose side who's on. You don't know who to talk to, or people are disappeared if they're anti-Ortega. So it's very difficult right now to be in country and be in any kind of relationship with any organization that had anything to do with ProNica. So we are not emailing. We're only using one encrypted app that we feel fairly safe about using to communicate. Yeah, we're nearing the end. So
I think something that is too heinous for most Americans to accept, and we know it's true because we lived through it with Nicaragua. Trump came along and knew he was getting a lot of political juice from the border. And he drove people out of their countries up to the border so that he could look good. And Nicaragua, as I understand it, is low on the totem pole. Very few people are trying to escape Nicaragua like they're trying to escape Guatemala and El Salvador. But America can't accept that we did these things and we drove them to the border. And then when they got to the border, we thought they were terrible. And that's what's going on.
well,
We need to be able to tell people that the funding was cut for security. And
right.
That's why they're coming to the border.
And that's why the archive is so important, because the archive will give people who want to write books and do research and bring clarity to America's role in everything that's happened in the last 100 years in Nicaragua. And I really think that we have a lot of support from different universities. There's several professors who are in chairs of Central American policy and economic departments that have never seen what we have in this archive. And it would be really helpful, I think, to help, create a timeline and maybe give some validity to things that people really have just been speculating about. I mean, we have empirical, writings, evidence, proof that certain things happened, like Ben Linder, for instance, and you just don't see that. Like I've listened to everything Noam Chomsky has had to say about Nicaragua, and honestly, I think I know more just poking around the office and being around all these people than Noam Chomsky knows about what really happened in Nicaragua. So,
My ex-wife insisted that our daughter go to a Christian school. I very quickly became known as the non-Christian parent of the Christian school. And they scheduled Oliver North to give a speech. And I went to the principal and I said, I'm not going to carry a sign. I'm not going to go crazy. But I want you to know who this guy is and what he's done. And I told him my opinion of Oliver North. And I left, and they canceled it. I was so proud of myself.
wow.
It completely turned around on the school guys who run it. Once it was brought to light that Oliver North didn't send a box of rifles, he sent tanks, he sent landmines, he sent major weapons, drove all the farmers out of the field, causing no food for everybody. And within a month, 1.5 million people moved into the city. No place to live. And as we stand here now, they haven't recovered from that.
No.
And you just can't move 1.5 million people into a city and expect it to survive. We did that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I interrupted you. No, I was just saying, it's really important to bring the truth out about things that happened, because policies, new policy going forward is made on history, right? And to bring clarity to what has actually taken place and the accountability that the US government really needs to step up to. I mean, that's what I see the role of the archive being, and that's how we're going to end it, one way or another. I know we'll formally close on December 31st. The NGO will be gone, and then the archive will just, have to be finished by volunteers, and I don't think that's going to be a problem. It's a big one, good size archive, like I said. So
It's odd that am I interrupting? I don't know. It's odd that we would be doing this with the University of Minnesota. This meeting has a historical relationship with the University of Minnesota. I wrote about it. One of our members was a participant in the starvation experiments that occurred at the University of Minnesota. The starvation experiments were to prepare us for the return of Europe. People who had been starving over a long period of time, we wanted to know how's the best way to bring them back to health. So Quakers volunteered to be starved. And one of those people was a member of our meeting. And it was University of Minnesota.
yeah, well, this archivist was very instrumental in the civil rights movement in Alabama, and he had traveled as, I really can't give you the back history on all of that, but he's very committed to Quakerism. He's surrounded by Quakers. They're all part of the peace and social justice movement that goes on in St. Paul, where he lives. And they're just, every time he talks to me or sends me photographs, I think, wow, that's where all the hipsters are. We should all be in St. Paul, but the weather.
I'd like to note we have about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
And so if anybody has a question, a comment that you want to make besides Herb, please do. Herb, you've been great. I loved your input. I want to know if anyone else has any concern or question.
She's telling me I talked to her.
Nancy.
I'd just like to add a little personal human touch to this.
Oh,
Marlene and I guess for the last group to go down to visit ProNica and understand ProNica. And it coincided, which was wonderful for us, with the board coming down. And so we were taken places that we would not have been taken otherwise. But just some of the stories, Herb talked about that graduation. These are little tykes, and their families have scraped together what they can. So the little tykes were in, the boys had black ties, and they all had to wear white gloves. And if you could have seen some of these tiny little hands in these adult white gloves kind of flopping on their fingers, but they were so proud. We went, I can't remember the story in detail, but it was so beautiful. We went to the orphanage that you spoke of. And the woman who started that had simply visited
Zelinda.
Nicaragua. And she was so taken by the misery of these street children that she ended up moving there and starting this very successful orphanage. We went to a softball game, I think, of the girls' softball team, and just the pride that they had and where they lived. And, you know, if they didn't win, it seemed like they did because they were just so filled with pride. We went to the maternity home, which again was so, this was the only place that women who had difficult pregnancies had to go to. And I think it was barely surviving, but it was certainly surviving. We went to a domestic violence program, really, and then they took us to one of the domestic violence places. But these were, you know, these are things that we have in the States, and they really make a critical difference in the States. But there, they were really matters of life and death. And oh, the one other thing that I was so impressed by, I think because the board was there, they had a meeting of all of the people who benefited from, you know, their programs benefited from ProNica. And I've been part of far too many budget meetings where everybody's trying to get more money than the other people and more, you know, I mean, they need it, but it's like a battle, you know, a politely disguised battle. And these people were genuinely, you know, one might say, well, I think maybe you need this $1,000 more than we do. I mean, it was just so Quakerly. And it was certainly, and I also think we should mention Pam and this brilliant, masterful idea of training women who had no way of livelihood other than selling their bodies, and to train them as hairdressers. And the way I remember the story, Pam went down with her daughter, and I think they were the first to visit the dump. And to just think of Pam, and I don't know, her daughter was maybe in her late teens.
No, she didn't have a driver's license yet, so she was 15 or so.
You know, in this vile dump, and learning to understand it and get a feel for it, and then to have this program emerge that I'm sure is still continuing now, isn't it?
As far as I understand, yeah.
So,
She was cutting hair ridden with lice.
so I just wanted to add that element because it was certainly a moving experience in
yes.
seeing the openness of people to helping other people. There was just an enormous generosity to us. I mean, we drove back from just one village with 2 geese, I think, live geese, and we'd have to get out and give them water every now and then. I mean, it was chickens. So,
I gotta say, Nancy has impressed the hell out of me with her memory. Wow, I couldn't do that.
Yeah, that Nancy's referring to witness tour. That we were
I was
on
on it.
last
I
witness.
was driving when we came back. Yeah. It was a tough one.
Well, we're doing good. We're hanging in there for the end. 2 more months.
Yeah, well, I get emails that rip your heart out of your chest.
Yeah.
The hardest part about the emails for me is some of them are actually coming from Mary Elena and people like that. Others are coming from people who stole Mary Elena's Facebook address. And they'll write to me asking for money. And I'll tell them why I can't do that. And then instantly they write back in perfect English why they need this money. And I know these people can't write back immediately in perfect English.
Right.
So it's very hard to decipher who's getting in touch with me. They were good days.
It is very close to time for us to close with a period of silence. Yarrow, do you have any last words you'd like to say before we move into silent worship?
Well, I would just like to thank everyone for all the support that you've given ProNica over the years and letting us do our crazy transition to closed with all those boxes and the jumble. And anyway, I think every little shred is out of the peace room, and I think my son helped to prepare the room for the new library. And I thought maybe before it's all over with, I would like to bind the newsletters and gift them to meeting, so it will have a whole history of the newsletters all the way from back in the 70s when they were just running on newsprint down in Nicaragua to the last one we published. So that'll be a gift for the library. That's one of my goals. So,
Nice.
so thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about ProNica.
Okay, Yarrow, we have a custom of giving some money for the organization that you're speaking of. Can we do that for ProNica at this point?
What I would ask is that we may need some funding for transportation or archive boxes. And I will not know that until January. We're in the process of creating a budget when the archivist comes down. So in the event that we are short on funding, I would request funding for archival materials. But really, right now, we're kind of, like I said, trying to spend down our money so that we can zero out our books, which means we close our operating account for our closure in December.
Sure. Okay.
So
Well,
it would be informal, maybe next year if need be, for archival materials.
yes. Okay. Thank you. Friends, could we go into a period of silence now and close our meeting?